Hey guys, welcome to Module 3 short lecture. Now this week we have our first Milestone 1 assignment. Now we have two milestone assignments, Milestone 1 here in Module 3 and Milestone 2 in Module 5. Now these will become part of your final project. So by completing Milestone 1 and Milestone 2, you would have completed about 2/3 of your final paper. The remaining 1/3 will be on critical elements that were not part of Milestone 1 and Milestone 2. So this week in your first milestone, what we're going to be doing is applying some of the things you've learned about both federal and state courts into our scenario fact pattern that has been developed for this course. So when you look at the assignment guidelines and grading rubric, you will find this is our scenario fact pattern. So there will be certain questions in Milestone 1 and Milestone 2 and in the remaining critical elements that were not part of Milestone 1 and Milestone 2 that are going to apply to the scenario. So you'll need to be familiar with the scenario fact pattern. And basically what we have is we have three characters, Jed, Herman, and Jane, that live in Washington, D.C. They go to a local bank in Washington, D.C., and they commit a bank robbery. And so the scenario outlines each individual's role within the bank robbery. And one of the things you'll learn is that Jed is an ex-felon, and both he and Herman were armed with shotguns during the robbery. And so that'll become important later when we talk about sentencing. And that's later on down the road, more towards the end of the class, okay? But it's very important for you, and it's incumbent upon you to read the scenario and be familiar with the basic fact pattern. Now, don't read too much into scenarios, all right? This is just a general fact pattern, so you have an idea as to what's happened here. If you read too much into it, then you're going to stray off course in a lot of your responses. So we're just going to try to keep it simple in terms of the basic fact pattern. If at any time you have any questions about the fact pattern, feel free to reach out and get a hold of me, and I'll be happy to answer those questions, okay? So this week our focus is going to be on judicial systems. And we're going to be looking at a couple different things here. We're going to be looking at the hierarchical structure for federal and state courts and local courts. We're going to try to explain the difference between why we have federal and state court system, what is subject matter jurisdiction, and how does it apply. And then we're going to be looking at which court would have jurisdiction for our scenario, our bank robbery, and how do we determine what court is going to hear the case, and what are some problems that can arise with the particular venue or court location that is selected. And then what is the specific venue for our scenario? In other words, what is the specific court that'll have jurisdiction over our case, okay? So that's basically what we're looking at. So let's first look at hierarchical structure. Now you've already done this in Module 1. You did a short paper on the federal court hierarchical structure, and you identified the primary role of each of those tiers within that structure. And then in your discussion board 2-1, you examine state courts and their structure by looking at specific states, and usually your home state. And so state courts can become a little bit more complicated, and I'll explain that in a little bit easy way to identify those tiers. Then we're going to talk about subject matter jurisdiction, determine venue, and venue. But let's take a look at the hierarchical structure. So this is what I'm looking for here. So we're going to identify the hierarchical structure for the court. So for example, the federal courts, the hierarchical structure would be at the top, United States Supreme Court, followed by the United States Circuit Courts of Appeals, followed by the United States District Courts, okay? Now, if you had to tell me the primary role of each, you could say, well, the primary role of the U.S. District Court is that they act as the trial courts for the federal judiciary, okay? Now, the Supreme Court and the Circuit Courts have similar roles. Both of them have a review function. In other words, they ensure that the lower courts have interpreted the law correctly and have applied it correctly. They also have a policy-making role. Oftentimes, the Supreme Court will make a decision such as Miranda versus Arizona, which is police has to advise you of your constitutional rights. Or they've ruled on school segregation, an array of things that apply, have a significant impact on most Americans, right? Those are policy-making decisions, right? Because when the Supreme Court ruled about Miranda, then police had to change their policies and had to outline what has to take place when you arrest somebody before you want to interrogate them. You have to read in the Miranda rights, okay? So that's basically the hierarchical structure for federal courts and some of the primary roles. Now, when we look at state courts and local courts, it might become a little bit more complicated, but we're going to try to keep it simple. Because I think if you look in your textbook on pages 58 through 63, they give you a good analysis and a good overview of the state court system. Now, the state court system can include, at the top, your state courts of last resort, your state intermediate courts, your trial courts of general jurisdiction, and your trial courts of limited jurisdiction, all right? So your trial courts of limited jurisdiction might be your justice of the peace type courts or municipal courts or city courts. Your trial courts of general jurisdiction might be your circuit courts or in some places the district courts or a superior court. In some states, there's, as we learned, your state courts of last resort have different names. Some of them might be like for California, be California Supreme Court. In some states, as we've learned this past week, it's different. Okay, so then you also need to tell me what the primary role of each of these are. Well, state Supreme Courts and state circuit courts, or state intermediate appellate courts, have very similar responsibilities as do their counterparts in the federal system. They have a review function and they often have a policy-making function, right? Your trial courts of general jurisdiction are those courts that handle your more serious offenses within the state, serious felony cases. Oftentimes they are assigned to family law matters. Whereas your trial courts of limited jurisdiction tend to handle the bulk of the cases, and those are your misdemeanor and infractions, speeding tickets, petty thefts, those type of things. That's their primary role, okay? So understand the structure and then the primary roles of each of those. So just summarize it briefly. Use your textbook as a good reference, and I think that will be very helpful for you, okay? Now, if we look at levels, next we have to look at levels, explain the primary differences between federal and state judicial systems, and describe the importance of having these levels. Well, as we've learned over the last couple of weeks, some of the differences between federal and state courts include jurisdiction, and I think that's the important one. Remember, jurisdiction is the authority of a court to hear a case. So in order for federal courts to hear a case, they have to have jurisdiction. If they don't have jurisdiction, they can't hear the case. It probably belongs to state court. So first of all, the primary difference is jurisdiction. Then we also learned that the manner in which judges reach the benches are different. Okay, federal system tends to have the lifetime appointment. The president nominates and the Senate confirms. In some states, as we learned in our discussion assignments in Module 2, it's an array of things. Judges are elected or appointed. In some states, judges are appointed for life, much like the federal court. So that's one of the differences between state and federal courts. The other thing is caseload. We've learned that the caseloads are different. State courts and local courts hear a lot more cases than the federal courts do. So those are some of the differences in between federal and state courts. So why do we have this dual court system? Why is it important in having these levels? Well, from an historical perspective, the founding fathers feared an overreaching federal government. Remember, the founding fathers were split on whether the power should lie with the federal government or with the states. And so as a compromise, they limited the power of the federal courts. So the federal courts basically have limited jurisdiction over certain types of cases, and those typically are those that involve U.S. Constitution or somehow violate federal statute, right? So that was one of the reasons to prevent a overreaching federal court system, and in other words, interfering with what's happening at the state level. The other reason is why it's important to have these levels is that, quite frankly, there are certain matters that would not be amenable to state courts. Among these are legal issues that span multiple states, like interstate crimes or disputes between states. Okay. Therefore, those type of cases not handled by the federal courts are handled by state courts, and those are going to be the bulk of the things that you and I have most. If you've ever been to court, you're more likely to be to state court, not federal court, because state courts handle an array of things such as family law issues, landlord-tenant disputes, and nearly all state criminal offenses. So the state courts serve us in that respect, right? The other major benefit of this system is that local courts are better able to shape their laws, decisions, and resources to fit the needs of their local communities. For example, whereas citizens of Los Angeles, California might have a need to reduce murder rates and gang violence, citizens of a small southern college town like Lexington, Virginia, may be more concerned with students' misbehavior and small-time drug offenses. So these levels allow us to address an array of legal issues that allows courts with proper jurisdiction to hear them. Okay, so those are some of the key reasons why it's important that we have these levels. Next, we have subject matter jurisdiction, and we're going to be looking at explain subject matter jurisdiction to federal, state, and local courts, and states its impact on judicial efficiency. Well, first you should define this concept. And subject matter jurisdiction is the authority of a court to hear a case of a particular type or cases relating to a specific subject matter. For instance, bankruptcy court only has the authority to hear bankruptcy cases, and juvenile court only has the authority to hear juvenile cases. These subject matter jurisdiction courts impact judicial efficiency in part because these courts have both the time and resources to vote to these types of cases. So more complex cases are going to require more court time. And so oftentimes, these specialized courts like juvenile courts have the resources, for example, to deal with juvenile crime and juvenile cases and juvenile offenders. Okay, that is part of it, because here we're talking about specialized courts, the subject matter jurisdiction in terms of specialized courts. But subject matter jurisdiction also helps us in answering if a case belongs to state or federal court. So who has subject matter jurisdiction over bank robbery? Well, in theory, both do. But if you look at the supremacy clause, federal law trumps state law. So federal authorities have the ability to prosecute bank robbery because bank robbery violates a federal statute. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. It also answers which specialized court in the respective judicial system has jurisdiction. For example, with state courts, the proper subject matter for crimes involving juveniles, like I just talked about, would be juvenile court. Filing cases in the wrong court because of a lack of subject matter jurisdiction, say in a civil case, can only delay and or cost a litigant valuable time in seeking some legal remedy. So it's important that in terms of subject matter jurisdiction, that any legal action that takes place, we need to make sure that the court in which we're going to file that legal action, or if the court is going to try to claim jurisdiction, then in fact they do have subject matter jurisdiction. All right. So that's what we're talking about when we refer to subject matter jurisdiction. So next we're going to talk about the concept of jurisdiction. And what I'm going to do here is take a break and come back to part 2, and I'm going to finish these last 3 critical elements quickly for you so that you don't get too overbogged with these short module lectures, okay? I'm usually going to try to keep these to about 20 minutes. So let me pause here and I will come right back. Thank you.